Now, many of you also had a lot of questions about the different tests that are used for the Equal Protection Clause to determine if the state is violating the Equal Protection Clause. There are three tests that are used to determine if the state is violating the Equal Protection Clause. You have the strict scrutiny test, the intermediate scrutiny test, and the rational basis test. Now, just so you understand, the strict scrutiny test and the intermediate scrutiny test, both these tests places the burden of proof on the government. Therefore, the government has to prove in strict scrutiny that it has a compelling governmental purpose to discriminate. Or if it's intermediate scrutiny, the government has to prove that this discrimination bears a substantial relationship to an important governmental goal. So these burdens make these two tests place the burden on the government to prove that they need to discriminate. Now, if you look at the first test, strict scrutiny, almost always, if the government discriminates based on race, it will be struck down as unconstitutional because that's what the strict scrutiny test basically will ensure. The government would have to prove it has a compelling governmental purpose to discriminate, and it is doing this discrimination in the least restrictive means necessary. So, if the government discriminates based on race, ethnicity, and don't worry about the alienage at this time, we'll talk about that later, but race or ethnicity, this is when strict scrutiny will apply. And the phrase I always say is almost always. This type of law that discriminates based on race and ethnicity will almost always be struck down as unconstitutional. Now, I always say the words almost always because when you guys read about affirmative action, it is possible that a government can discriminate, but we call this reverse discrimination because who are you discriminating against? The white majority. In affirmative action programs, you will read this week in the Texas case, if the government proves that it is necessary to discriminate with this affirmative action policy, because they have to create a critical mass of diverse students, because when you have a diverse student population, that's good for the university, because it teaches them tolerance, and it also teaches them different cultures. So when they go in the workforce, they know how to deal with people from different backgrounds and different cultures. So this actually benefits the graduate university students. So that's the Texas case. That's what you're going to read about. Part of their discussion has to do with, well, are they doing this in the least restrictive means possible? And that's why you have all those tests that they use to figure out what's the best way to ensure we create a critical mass of diverse students. That's the case you're going to be learning about this week. Well, that was a strict scrutiny test. That's one of the rare instances in which the Supreme Court allowed a form of discrimination based on race, in this case reverse discrimination, to be upheld and to pass the strict scrutiny test. But in most cases, if the state's going to discriminate based on race, it will be struck down as unconstitutional based on the strict scrutiny test. Because usually the government's not going to be able to prove it has a compelling governmental purpose in trying to discriminate someone based on race. All right, the next one is the gender basis. This is the intermediate scrutiny test. Sometimes the government can prove it needs to discriminate, sometimes it can't. Well, what does the government have to prove? That there's a substantial relationship to an important governmental goal. I'll just give you two examples here. One example was a case that had to do with statutory rape in the state of California. At the time, back in the 70s, California said if you were a male and you were accused and convicted of statutory rape, you could be convicted if you committed statutory rape at age 18. However, if a woman is accused of statutory rape, she can only be convicted if she's at least 21 or over. So the question is, why do you have this type of gender discrimination? Why is it a male at 18 can be convicted of statutory rape, but a female who would be 18 cannot be convicted of statutory rape? Well, in this case, the Supreme Court will say, this is the Michael M. case, the Supreme Court will say that the government does have a substantial relationship to an important governmental goal. This important governmental goal is this: what can an 18-year-old male do to their victim that an 18-year-old female cannot do to her victim. And that's teenage pregnancy. See, an 18-year-old male can impregnate a woman, but obviously, I'd probably say a girl because it'd be underage, whereas a female who's 18 can't impregnate a male, at least not for now. Anyway, my point is the government proved it had a substantial relationship in preventing teenage pregnancies. So that's why they had that age difference. Now, just so you know, in case you're wondering, California changed that law. It's statutory rape for women now at age 18. But in the 70s, a woman would only be convicted if she was over 21. All right, so that's one example where that type of gender discrimination was allowed. Now, in a Mississippi case, Mr. Hogan wanted to attend an all-female nursing school. However, the state of Mississippi would not allow him to attend that all-female university school, and so he challenged it, saying this violates the Equal Protection Clause. Goes to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court asked the state, well, what is your substantial relationship to an important governmental goal here? And they claimed that women would be affected if men were at this university. That would affect their ability to learn, that would cause distractions. This is why they must provide this opportunity only for females to attend this university. Well, the Supreme Court disagreed with that logic, and they said, you are actually not trying to protect females at this university. You are just trying to perpetuate a stereotype. I wonder what that stereotype is. That's right, that only females should be nurses. So Mr. Hogan would have to be admitted into that all-female university. So I gave you two examples in which the state was able to prove it has a substantial relationship to discriminating. That was a statutory rape case in California. And then one in which the Supreme Court said, no, you didn't prove there was a substantial relationship. And that was the University of Mississippi case dealing with the all-female nursing school. All right, lastly, the government, the state government, is given a lot of latitude in discriminating if it's going to discriminate based on disabilities, sexual orientation, alienage, and illegal aliens. Now, one thing I don't add, and also include age and economic legislation. Age is the easy one. Think about this. Is it easy for the government to discriminate based on age? Yes. How old do you have to be in order to drive? Most states require you're 16. Well, that's age discrimination. Well, would it be easy for the government to prove that this is a reasonable law? Because you don't want 10-year-olds driving cars. That's right. So my point is, when you look at the rational basis test, in this test, the burden's not on the government to prove that it's rational, that it's reasonable. The burden is actually placed on the person being discriminated against. So the 10-year-old would have to say, I have a right to drive. I don't know if you remember, there was a 10-year-old in Florida a couple of years ago who stole his grandmother's, took his grandmother's car and did a little bit of joyriding around town. And he drove it like a pinball, like he was playing a pinball machine, and he was hitting cars left and right. But anyway, do you want to stop that kind of behavior and basically not allow that kind of driving to take place? Absolutely. So it's easy for the state to discriminate based on age. Economic legislation, it's easy for the state to discriminate based on wealth. I mean, if you make more money, can they charge you more in taxes? Yes. So I don't want to go into greater detail on this. I'm just introducing this ideal that if the state discriminates based on age, economic legislation, disabilities, sexual orientation, aliens and illegal aliens we'll talk about later, it's easier for the government to prove that it's reasonable discrimination. Now again, when you're doing the rational basis test, it's not up to the government to prove it's reasonable. The person being discriminated against has to suggest it's not reasonable. And there have been cases in which a person, a living home, and you'll read about this later, was able to prove that the type of discrimination they faced by not being allowed to have a residential housing service in a neighborhood, that was not a reasonable form of discrimination. But you'll read about that later. So Three tests to use to determine when states can discriminate. If it's going to discriminate based on race or ethnicity, it's almost always struck down based on the strict scrutiny test, because the government has to prove it has a compelling governmental purpose to discriminate, which is almost difficult, if not impossible, to prove. Affirmative action is the only case where that's been allowed. Intermediate scrutiny, if the government's going to discriminate based on gender, then it has to prove it has a substantial relationship, that discrimination has a substantial relationship to an important governmental goal. Sometimes that type of discrimination will be allowed, sometimes it won't. And then finally, if the state's going to discriminate based on age, economic legislation, etc., it's almost always going to be allowed based on the rational basis test. All the government has to prove is that it's a reasonable form of discrimination. And by the way, it's up to the person being discriminated against to prove that it's not reasonable.